All right, hello everybody. Thank you for joining us today. Welcome to the second of our spring BPS training. Today our topic is integrated or changing considerations for integrated resource planning for systems in transition. There's been a lot of movement on this topic recently. Various states are at various stages of implementing their IRPs where applicable. So I think this is very timely, and we appreciate the experts we have online today. First, I'll introduce myself. I'm a Principal Regulatory Policy Specialist here at NREL in the Center for Partnerships and Innovation. We support topics including resource adequacy, performance-based rate making, and the interplay between state and federal implementation, while also maintaining reliable systems throughout the country. This training series is made possible with funding from the U.S. Department of Energy, specifically the Grid Deployment Office, so thanks to them. We're also partnering with the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory, and then the National Renewable Energy Laboratory during this series. Finally, I want to thank my colleague Jessica Diaz, who's really helped pull together some of the logistics and preparation and running these courses, so thanks to her. If you have any feedback or suggestions or want to learn a little bit more about what NREL is doing in this space, please don't hesitate to reach out. We recently released a report in November on resource adequacy considerations for state regulators. So you might want to check that out. But otherwise, my email is at the bottom of the page here. So last Tuesday, we heard from experts at EPRI, E3, and Astrape Consulting about capacity accreditation. That one's going to be posted in case you missed it. You can download it, download the presentations, and watch the recording. Next Tuesday, we'll wrap up this three-part series with with a course on the changing dynamics of regional and interregional transmission planning. So I encourage you all again to take a look at our website. The link is on this slide at the bottom there. You can, again, go back to the 10 other courses that we have on an array of bulk power system topics. Those are all available along with the presentations and recordings. And again, these topics are largely focused on resource adequacy and reliability. If you have other topics that you'd like to bring to us, please let me know. Again, this particular live webinar is available just to NREL members. So if you're on here, I'm assuming you work for a commission, but we also want to target these towards the broader regulatory community. So again, I'll reiterate, this is to support you all. We want to offer tools that are useful and applicable in your various states. But otherwise, we're going to take a look at our agenda for today. We are excited to hear from our 5 presenters. They are all experts in their respective subject areas. We have allotted 30 minutes for each subtopic, including Q&A. I encourage you all to use the Q&A feature in the Zoom there to submit your questions. Either our speakers will answer on a rolling basis or they'll wait until the end. But we're hoping everyone can also stick around until the final 10 minutes or so. We'll have sort of additional discussion and look at some more cross-cutting issues. But with that, first we're going to hear from Bruce Biewald, who's just a minor adjustment in the original agenda here. Bruce is going to set us up on the issues and contexts around a report that they've been working on there at Synapse on integrated resource planning. And Bruce is working with our second speaker, Juan Pablo Carvalho, JP Carvalho with the LBNL, Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. And they're laying out some of the newer issues around modeling and IRPs with respect to load growth, and particularly smaller pockets of load growth and EVs that we're seeing coming on the system, and how those are incorporated into regional planning. Dr. Carvalho will also touch on resource adequacy components and some scenario analysis. So after that, we'll step away for about 10 minutes. At 2:10, we'll come back at 2:20, and our third subtopic will go a little bit deeper here. We're going to hear from 2 speakers, Wesley Cole and Caitlin Murphy, both from the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, and their focus is going to be on accounting for uncommon resources that we're seeing in various planning models. And finally, we're going to hear from Anna Maleva with Blue Marble Analytics. Anna has worked on a series of studies related to this topic, specifically resource planning, particularly in the West. So she'll take us through sort of the reliability impacts around resource additions and retirements. So with that, I'll go ahead and introduce our first speaker. Bruce Biewald is the founder and CEO of Synapse Energy Economics. He founded Synapse in 1996 to remedy the entrenched decision-making practices that impede progress towards better energy systems in the United States. Through robust economic analysis and electric sector modeling, he has supported clients to chip away at the dominance of polluting and inefficient fossil plants. Bruce brings over 30 years of consulting experience on issues in energy economics and the electricity industry regulation. He has co-authored more than 100 reports and has testified in more than 100 cases, including utility regulatory proceedings in 25 states, in front of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, 2 Canadian provinces, and before the U.S. House of Representatives Committee on Energy and Commerce. Prior to founding Synapse, Bruce was employed for 15 years at Energy Systems Research Group, later which became the TELUS Institute. So Bruce, I'll hand it over to you, and thanks for kicking us off here.
Yeah, thanks. Can you hear me okay? Sounds good.
Yep.
It's good to be here. Thanks for the introduction. I really like talking about utility resource planning. It's the theme of this is going to be let's do it as well as possible. Let's get better at it. And in particular, a checklist doesn't solve all the issues with resource planning, but JP and I and our teams have been working on a checklist that we hope will be helpful. So next slide, please. So Synapse, that was a long enough introduction. The main thing I want to add is that, we're like 50 really hardworking, smart nerds working on these topics, not exclusively resource planning, but that's right at the core of what we do. So a lot of the other things that we work on are kind of adjacent to utility IRP. And so we're in lots of cases all around the country every year. So we're pretty broad, or speaking for myself, these days I have a pretty broad sense of what's going on, but maybe not in the kind of depth that some other people do who are actually participating themselves in the cases as analysts, modelers, or witnesses. So next topic, next slide. So this is what I intend to say today, right? That utility planning is important. I probably don't have to convince you if you're here on the call today, but should talk a little bit about that. And I'm going to, maybe overstate the case a little bit. You be the judge. But I'm going to paint a kind of bleak picture of the state of the art, and then how difficult it can be for regulators, given the state of the art and the stakes. And then in addition, I think it's possible that we can do better. In fact, we really should. We must do better. And then let's talk about how to do that, including this checklist and the project that we're working on now. So and I kind of want to close with what can we do to really kind of build the community here and create a sense of pride and expertise, excellence around these issues. So, I think the idea of analysts kind of doing these on their own, or, you're back in your office, sitting there kind of running a model or critiquing a model or reviewing an IRP is tough. And there really needs to be, there's some, but there could be more, I think, community and more exchanging of ideas and building. So this training is actually a great example of that. And then what I'm looking forward to thinking with others about what else we could do. Next slide, please. So the stakes are high. This is important. This is the long history of capacity, not energy, capacity in the U.S. Notably, back in the 70s, we got a lot of coal plants, some nuclear plants coming online. The spike in gas really stands out. I mean, we added over 200 gigawatts of gas capacity in just a few years. was 250 gigawatts in 5 years or so. That was a big change, a lot of investment there. And then more recently, they were adding renewables and gas and retiring coal plants. So the system is changing. It's changing in ways that are important for operations. And then if you look to the future and extrapolate some of these changes, then we've got our hands full figuring out how to maintain resource adequacy and how to invest in the resources that make sense given costs and environmental goals and so on. Next slide. So here, this is the energy mix. Coal has been decreasing since about 2005 in terms of the energy mix, along with the retirements. The gas capacity, the gas generation has increased. So on balance, we're reducing carbon emissions because the gas emissions per megawatt are about half of coal. But maybe not fast enough, depending on what you think about the global climate. And the renewable slice here is ticking up. Next slide. So in this context, utility resource planning is really important. What's the mix of what we're going to build? How are we going to bring on these clean resources, new resources, and keep the lights on, and so on? And I would say the state of the art is really not very good. I mean, I would give some resource plans an F. I would give some a C, maybe B minus. I think, and maybe my standard is too high, but I think for these, given the stakes, in terms of the investment involved, tens of billions of dollars, hundreds of billions of dollars across the country, and the importance of public health and climate and reliability, you really want to get this right. So I think we could do better. And I'm going to talk about some of the kinds of problems with the research plans, and then some of the solutions, and then JP will go, I think, dig in deeper on some of what needs to be done. Next slide. So the kinds of issues in research plans, some of it's really simple. I mean, there are actual errors. So like when you open the hood on the modeling, you almost always find errors, sometimes enormous errors that really influence the output. So this might be things like taking a cost projection that's in nominal dollars over 20 or more years, but it's putting it in current dollars, or so having inflation in there or not, or things like that. They're just errors, or sometimes some of the constraints might be overspecified, where there's an input that says, oh, we can only build 5 megawatts of wind per year on this system, and a constraint like that might be buried in the details of the model inputs. So you wouldn't see that if you were to just read the report. But if you open the hood and look inside and see what's going on about, there's a constraint. Oh, that's why it only builds 5 megawatts of wind, because that was the limit set by the modelers. So there can be some bias in the inputs. I think we'll talk a little bit more about that. There are end effects. I mean, if the studies run through, say, 25 or 30 years, maybe you don't worry that much about end effects. But sometimes models are run for 10, 15 years, and then the how you handle and you might be building resources. Here we are in 2024. A new resource might be coming online in 2034 and 2035. So if the model is only run through 2040, you don't really get a long time period of that simulation of that resource being run on the system. So it has the end effects is the time frame for the study period, the lead time for generating resource additions, and then making sure that we handle long-term well. Myopia listed here, there's this kind of looking just at what's in front of your face sometimes. There may be, say, environmental regulations that are under development or draft but not final, and then you might reasonably expect some other pollutant to be regulated on the heels of that, maybe a year or two later. And often we see resource plans that just sort of say, hey, we can't anticipate these things, they're uncertain, and therefore we're just going to pretend they don't exist, or maybe deal with them as a sensitivity case at the end that we don't really pay attention to. And I would argue that it's important to be realistic about what's reasonably likely to happen, And that means regulations, new regulations over the next couple of years, over the next 5 years, over the longer term. Again, it's difficult, there's uncertainty, but that's not a reason to pretend that these things are not going to affect the resource costs and constraints. Geographic boundaries can be tough. Like if the bigger you get with your model geography, the longer runtimes can be, so that there are practical constraints. You need more data to model the whole. Say that sometimes you want to model the whole eastern interconnection for a system that's in PJM, and so there's some judgments that have to be made that can be tricky about how big a system to model in terms of space, and then also over time. Risk and uncertainty are tough. Everyone agrees, risk and uncertainty are important to include. JP is going to give us some good advice about these things, but I think as a general matter, it's just really important to be thinking in a coherent, thoughtful, well-documented way about risk and uncertainty that has kind of the full range of possible risks that affect the resource choices. And then also kind of make sure that it's not so, running every crazy scenario, so then the results are uninterpretable or not useful for decision making. So there's an art and a science to that. Sunk costs are tricky. Sunk costs shouldn't matter in a sense, right? Sunk costs are sunk, but I think that they're often foremost on a utility's mind as they're doing resource planning. And so things like, how are the unrecovered, undepreciated plant costs for this asset that might be retired going to figure in is a tricky issue. And I think in general, resource planning should be done without just on the basis of forward-going avoidable costs, and then figure out the stranded cost recovery issues and options as a separate matter. But sometimes you can't do that. Documentation, some resource plans are well documented. Often there's a lot missing, and it's difficult to figure out what's going on in the plan if you don't have all of the information. And transparency is good, right? There should be transparency. As a practical matter, there's often I think a hostility to stakeholder input, withholding of the model runs. So I would like to see. I would hope that commissioners would want to see full inputs and outputs when a company files their analysis in a planning case or an IRP case. File the model runs in machine readable format so that stakeholders and participants can actually review the details, sometimes find mistakes and errors, sometimes identify key assumptions that might need to be changed or tested. And as a practical matter, what we often find in resource plans is that it takes a long time to ask for the model runs, to get past the NDAs and the objections, and then get to a model input file that's half of the inputs but not the rest. So there's this kind of it seems to be reluctance to share and subject the analysis to review, and I think that doesn't help. It would be way better, particularly in terms of commissions being able to make good decisions about these plans if there were more information available. So, next slide, please. So there's an issue, as a witness, I don't comment on this at all. It's just the runs are what they are. But I think if you're sort of thinking about how to improve this space, how to improve the state of the art, how to think as a regulator in terms of what's to be done, I think it's important to kind of recognize both the technical challenges and the motivational challenges, right? So on the technical side, this is just hard, especially the uncertainties, risks, volatilities. The models are, they're pretty good, but there's some limitations that can be challenging. And the whole exercise is time consuming, and the modeling is expensive, and the process and participation can be time consuming. But I think it's important to not overlook or gloss over the motivational issues. I think I could say over decades of doing this that a lot of times I feel that utilities are kind kind of pretending to care about customers and are actually focused more on returns to shareholders. They're thinking a lot about sunk costs. In many contexts, you can't really talk about sunk costs, and yet that can be one of the big motivating elephant in the room that no one's mentioning, but there it is. So worrying about disallowances, thinking about the Average Johnson incentives to grow, and I think utilities just in general are not kind of creative, innovative entities, and so I'd really like to work with others to figure out how to identify the best practices, where they are doing well, and kind of highlight those and try to get those copied, as well as create incentives, align incentives to innovate, and then in some cases just get utilities kind of out of the way so they're the platform that others can innovate on top of. Next slide. So one of the challenges for regulators in an IRP is you can go through a process. It could be 6 months or a year, and then there was some model runs, there's some stakeholder input, this and that, and then at that point you might be able to accept or reject it. In some cases, the commissions just acknowledge or maybe can refuse to acknowledge, but that's a terrible outcome, I think, for everybody, right? And it would be better. I think the utilities would like to have the IRPs approved or accepted, acknowledged, and serve as a basis for good decision making in the future, and some common understanding among the stakeholders and with the regulators and customers. So what can be done? Well, I mentioned before, providing the model inputs up front, so that can really help kind of get a jump on the process, so issues are identified early rather than at the end. I think it would be great to have an actual witness who signs, their testimony is basically saying, hey, this model run, the model runs we're providing here are reasonably accurate and up to date. Here's how we developed the inputs. Here's the QC we did, and kind of verify as a person that it meets minimum standards. Often in IRPs, where we find a problem, there's kind of finger pointing or, sort of fell through the cracks. This witness was covering these topics. This company witness was covering these other topics. Different people are responsible for different things. And the idea that, it was someone else's fault or just kind of fell through the cracks is sad, and I think should be avoidable. So, I think a commission that wants to solve this could, insist that there's a witness who basically testifies that this meets, some basic standards, or at least is responsible. Who's responsible for the overall coherency and accuracy and up-to-dateness of the inputs? And so, along those lines, a checklist or a list of practices could be helpful, right? And the idea then, if there are these kind of standards or basic things to check, then that's the kind of thing that a utility planner could look at and say, well, are we doing all of these things? Check, 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 check. Okay, this is. It doesn't mean that the plan is great. It doesn't mean that everything is fine, but it could mean that at least it's met these kind of it's not making the common errors, or where it deviates, maybe there'd be an explanation there. Or if a commission wanted to give the utility direction and say, hey, we care about these 50 things. Here's the checklist. Why don't you make sure that your plan satisfies all these, or if it doesn't, tell us, where it doesn't, so we'll know. So I think that kind of thing could be helpful. It ought to be in the regulators' toolbox. I'd like to see it become common practice in utility IRP regulation. Next slide. So I touched on some of these points in the talking about the problems, but this is I'm kind of trying to state it rather than just being pejorative or negative and curmudgeonly about things. Like what could you do, right? And I think there's a whole set of things. Here's half a dozen. And we're working on a report that will have a much longer list and some text and examples supporting each of these things. And so the set here are kind of like the basics. I think of this as kind of bringing up the floor to kind of what ought to be like minimum acceptable standard for this. And because having the things be up to date, documenting new resource costs and being reasonable about those, thinking about forward-going costs, not sunk costs, and thinking about at least having one scenario that has the expected future. So not a bunch of kind of scenarios designed around themes that are kind of like unlikely or worst case or high case. I think that can often be confusing. That can be a part of the IRP filing and analysis, but you want at least one scenario to be the planner's best projections of the key inputs. And JP is going to talk about some of the key issues in terms of the emerging issues that make IRPs challenging. Next slide. So I've been working hard at supporting and nurturing modelers, right? And we train witnesses. We try to really have our internal boot camps and trainings, and make sure that we're really doing quality work around these issues kind of in-house. And I think we could really work as a broader community around kind of modeling. I mean, it can be lonely being a electric power system modeler or an expert witness. And I think having a groups and in real life or online where you can kind of talk about issues, again, kind of like this, and it could be super helpful. I think standards, I mean, it's kind of like accountants have, there's FASB standards for accounting. There's all sorts of professions have standards. And I feel like I haven't seen really modeling standards around kind of there's the kind of ethics part, but there's also just like, basic good practice or best practice for applying models to power system, planning and operations. So checklists could be helpful. We did a report like this about 11 years ago. It was one of our best free report sellers, our best sellers, downloaded more than any other report on our website, is well cited by in other practices, but it's 10 years old, so it's pretty out of date, and that's why I'm excited that we've been working on this update. So there'll be a 2024 very expanded version of this best practices in IRP. I think of it as kind of, by resource planners for resource planners, by nerds for nerds. I mean, this is more kind of nitty gritty, hands-on practical advice as I see it. And this will include the checklist that I've been talking about. I think trainings are super important. I'd love to be involved. I'm happy to be involved in this. Love to be involved in more presentations. I'd like to have more of an online community. I don't know, whether bits and pieces of this exist, but some of the model vendors have groups that they'll convene their model users to talk about things. But I think it should be cutting across models. And sometimes those groups need to complain about the model vendors, and that would be an extremely useful thing. So I'd love to see some more community around best practice and model applications and troubleshooting. What are the challenges that we run into as modelers and people who want to do good integrated resource planning? And then lastly, you definitely should watch our Energy Nerd show. It comes out every week or so, and maybe you could be a guest on the show. We like to talk about complicated technical problems in energy modeling. So that's what I've got to say today. Thanks for listening.
Thanks a lot, Bruce. We got a couple of questions before I get to those. Can you tell us where the Energy Nerd Show is? Is that like a YouTube series or on your website?
It's a video series. We've been making it since the beginning of the pandemic. So there's a couple hundred episodes. If you just Google Energy Nerd Show, it's got a website. It's on YouTube. We posted on LinkedIn and the other. It's on all the platforms. There's an audio version, which I think is kind of boring because mostly what we like is to talk about a graph or a table or an interesting thing a map. We love maps. So if you like this kind of modeling webinar training, you probably would like the Energy Nerd Show, or probably should be a guest on the show, frankly.
Well, I'm going to go back to one of your slides at the beginning. We had a question that came up on the incremental capacity chart, and I think the question was, what was causing the dip in renewables in the past year? I guess this.
Yeah, well, that would be 2022, and so this is not 2023 data, and I don't know. I feel like one of the things we've seen. So it's not a decrease. It's a decrease in the rate of increase. One thing it might. This is speculating, but I know that interconnections are a big issue, right? So for utility scale renewables, interconnection queues have been definitely a challenge, and also I know that sometimes there are issues around the policies. So if there's some new extension of the PTC or we have some of these bigger policies, right, in 2023, and so sometimes there's a waiting to see what's going to happen with policies. But basic answer is I don't know, and that that renewable piece has got to keep going up. The rate. We need more additions and the rate. One thing, if you look at this graph, the gas spike there, right, I think does demonstrate that we can add 70 gigawatts of capacity a year in the U.S., right? So, we've done it before. And so I think that's, evidence that it could be done again. We want to do it differently. In that case, a lot of the people building those gas plants are kind of like lemmings, all rushing to get the plants built, and a large number of those plants ended up being underwater, sold for nickel on the dollar, being run by the financial institutions. It's like, so that's not a happy scenario, but I think it does demonstrate that when we as a whole community of finance and building and utility all focus on getting something built large scale fast, it can happen.
There it is. We got one more question, and then I think we had a raised hand that we might go to. Now we got another one that just dropped in, but I'll talk about Justin's first. He says, sort of playing devil's advocacy, seems like a consideration of sunk costs in the form of unprecedented net book value would be a practical reality that should be evaluated. If retirement of an existing plant needs to be paid for by current customers through securitization, stranded asset recovery, etc., not considering the cost on customers would seem to be an inaccuracy in the process, at least to me. So,
here's the thing: is that by the standard practice is to basically assume that those costs. Let's say it's $100 million that maybe it's a 40 or 50-year-old plant, but there were some pollution controls installed or something. So right now you got a plant balance of $100 million. If the plant continues operating for another 10 or 20 years, then that $100 million will be recovered along with other costs, right, from customers with a return of and on that cost, right? And then if the plant's retired, it would likely also be recovered. So when I say, ignore the sunk costs, I mean, basically for planning purposes, assume that they're going to be recovered either way, or that they don't matter. And we're minimizing the damages. So we want to stop throwing good money after bad. We want to stop making the problem worse. First rule of holes, stop digging, right? And so that's what I would recommend. And then there should be analysis of the sunk costs and how it's handled. Is it going to be securitized? Is it going to be disallowed? Maybe it's not used neutral, just be disallowed. Or maybe it should be recovered with the same return as a used and useful prudent plant. But I feel like those set of rate making decisions and rate treatment of the sunk stranded costs ought to be thought of separately. And if they get merged in with the planning decision, then what you can end up doing is making decisions that worsen the overall loss. Or I suppose you might say, if the plant's closed, then it's not going to be recovered from customers. So then would you count that 100 million as a credit to customers? So that scenario is more attractive in terms of revenue requirements, because you're assuming the sunk cost, stranded costs will be disallowed. And I don't think that's really fair either, right? So I think what you want to do is treat them in a thoughtful way after we've minimized do a sensible plan on a forward basis, and then grapple with the sunk cost rate treatment.
Great. And I think this next question is kind of a follow-up on the incremental additions here. He says that Orland says U.S. electric generating capacity additions are looking at the rate. I think it's important. It's a throttle on, throttle off kind of thing, not just an increase in capacity or decrease. We'll move on to Riley's question here. It's about the scope of IRPs and how they have and should include or should evolve in the future. For example, to what extent should an IRP extend to optimize the distribution system relative to the dynamic pressures associated with electrification and distributed energy resources? So that's for Commissioner Allen.
Yeah, well, I think in the future there's a lot of electric system. There's a lot of things that relate to the electric side. I think the gas IRP has got its whole other set of issues, but fits right in with electric system IRP and the distribution system. So absolutely, there should be some optimization. I don't think the tools exist to really do that well. Maybe JP can speak more to this, but I think that there's a first level planning along with, say, the load forecast and the demand forecast of assuming that the distribution system is being addressed thoughtfully. So there's going to be a lot of electrification, a lot of distributed loads for EV charging, for heat pumps, electrification of industry. And then there's got to be distribution system build out to accommodate that, and smart rate designs and thinking about flexibility for all that new load in addition to the old load. So all of that is an important part of preparing for the future and ought to be in the IRP as much as reasonably possible. And then the utility scale resources and transmission, the high voltage stuff, can be planned around that. And ideally, maybe there's some iteration back and forth. I don't think there's a tool that will just allow you to optimize the whole thing. There are ways to sort of use these old school tools to build in some scenarios, say, for the distribution system build out, the load shapes for these new loads, and whatever management we're going to do of the flexibility of those new loads. So that can all feed into then the utility scale IRP model.
Great.
But the CADR isn't great. I wish it would be.
Commissioner Ham has your hand is up. I can unmute you if you'd like, or you can put your question in the chat. I'll go ahead and unmute you just to, if you still have a question. Okay, then we'll carry on here. Thanks again, Bruce. Really appreciate the insights, and I think we'll move to sorry, we have one more question that I think that's, yeah, I don't know if you can answer this fairly quickly so we can stay on schedule here, Bruce, but question is from Orland again. I've seen utility IRPs diversifying their energy generation sources. I think diversification is always a good thing in energy. However, it is often diversification and subtraction of, for example, natural gas. What can regulators do to ensure energy diversification is done where it makes sense for each resource mix?
Yeah, so always is a tough word, right? So usually diversification makes sense. There's different ways to measure it. I think one of the things to do is do the kind of scenario analysis that JP is going to talk about, and what that gets to is a kind of understanding, a kind of modeling and understanding quantification of the benefits of diversity. So different sorts of diversity different sorts of resources diversify, say, against fuel price risk, but maybe towards some other risk. And so the benefits of having your eggs in different baskets is an analyzable thing. And I think that a thoughtful modeling can explore that pretty effectively.
Okay, well, we'll move on to JP next. So JP is a research scientist at in the Energy Markets and Policy Department at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. Dr. Carvalho has done his research area on long-term power system planning, integration, and planning of distributed energy resources in electric vehicles, as well as reliability and resilience valuation. Dr. Carvalho has a PhD and an MS in energy and resources from the University of California at Berkeley, as well as a PE and BS degree in electronics engineering from the Universidad Técnica Federico Santa Maria, Chile. I'm working on my Spanish. I hope that was all right. I'll turn it to you, JP. Thanks.
Thanks, Ella. You did great. That's kind of part of the test that I put for the moderators here. Is it okay if I share my slides just quickly, just so I can? Oh, excellent.
I think that'll be easier. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Turn it to you.
So
Great.
I avoid the next slide sort of
Okay.
petition. All right. Well, it's great to be here. I think again, it's probably my second or third time presenting in NERC. This time I'm sort of doing the complementary presentation to the great ideas that Bruce already shared. As he mentioned, all of them included in our upcoming report that should be hopefully out in the next couple of months. And I'm going to focus on a selection of best and emerging practices that is specifically focused on electrification and decarbonization of power systems. So Bruce focused on practices that we should implement regardless of where the system is going. You know, we know the system is moving towards electrification of end users. That's coming with a set of challenges, and it's moving towards decarbonization, and that's also bringing some challenges. But regardless of that, the recommendations that Bruce made were essentially aspects of planning that we should get right regardless. I am going to touch more on three specific buckets of aspects of IRP that I'm going to pass some of the best practices and emerging practices that we have been outlining in our report. I think at the core, the key emerging challenge in resource planning these days is the new type of uncertainty that is being brought up and the new types of risk that are being brought up, again, through electrification and decarbonization. There are many new types of challenges that are arising in load forecasting, and I'm going to spend a little bit of time describing what are potential practices there. This new growth and also the more larger prevalence of inverter-based resources is starting to challenge some of the ways we have done resource adequacy, and Anna Maliva has a deeper dive on that, but I'm going to bring a few elements specific to IRPs that we have been analyzing recently that we wanted to show here in terms of practices. And then I'm going to spend some time outlining aspects relating to modeling. I have a little bit on scenarios, but the scenario space is so broad that I had a hard time fitting all this in a presentation. We could do a single presentation in just scenario design and analysis, but I'm going to share a few practices there. Finally, I wanted to show, well, I'm actually going to move to this one, but before you even start reading some of the content, I want to show that I'm using this sort of three categories as I move forward in terms of categorizing some practices as traditional, which could be the non-pejorative ways to say insufficient, which is, you know, ways in which we used to do some of these or develop some of these components in IRP that, again, in light of the emerging and the evolution, the emerging challenges of the power system are now insufficient. I outlined here some best practices that I'm going to expand on. And then, as you will see in the report, we are offering what we call emerging or aspirational or best wishes practices, future wish practices, which are where we believe things should go in terms of the natural evolution of some of these components of IRP. And this is a structure that we use already as LBNL in a relatively recent report on resource adequacy guidelines, particularly focused on IRP. And we found it and we received feedback that it was very useful because you as regulators can look and see where your utilities you oversee fall within these three different categories and start thinking how you can move them from one to the other. So I'm going to start with load forecast. I'm going to pick three specific aspects of load forecast. The first is focus on methods. So traditionally, most IRPs have relied on relatively simplified or complex, but sort of backward-looking econometrics or ANOVA type of methods. And these are essentially methods that, for better or for worse, replicate what has been in the past. This method proved particularly I don't want to say harmful, but particularly inaccurate at the onset of the economic crisis in 2008 and 2009, because they were replicating trends in load growth that were non-applicable given the new realities of the economic system. And as you know, we started at that point in 2008 and 9, probably a decade of flat load growth. And many utilities kept predicting that trend was going to break, in part because their models were anchored in a past that did not exist anymore. This is ever so more important now that the near past, or even any time frame looking back, will do a poor job for at least the next few years in predicting what's going to happen in the future, with especially the appearance of new types of end uses and new types of loads in the system, ranging from electric vehicles to heat pumps for space heating, all the way to data centers and other types of or fleet electric transportation fleet for freight and drayage services. We're proposing that a best practice in this space for now is to go to or leverage more a type of method that has been around for a while, the statistically adjusted end use models, the SAE models. A few utilities have been using these consistently over the last decade, but it has not been adopted as a widespread practice. And that's in part because it's a type of method that requires significantly more data, and that requires and gives more, it has the benefits that it gives more flexibility to really understand the uptake and adoption of certain end uses, and then to incorporate expected gains in efficiency of those end uses, such that we can reflect both the adoption levels and the usage patterns in the same model. And this is where we think the emerging practice should go, is essentially starting from the same approach of statistically adjusted end use models, and flow into a much more granular set of models that predict the adoption and the usage of specific end uses looking forward. And in particular, the usage is an aspect that has not been considered as much in the past. Typically, you would represent an end use or a type of load with a single peak. The truth is that at this point, and as I'll show in several other practices, we need to think hourly. And this is particularly important for very flexible types of end uses like EV charging, where the shape of the charge is going to substantially differ depending on the type of incentives that customers are going to receive, both either through prices or through direct load controls for some programmatic approaches to EV charging. So in both ways, what we're suggesting here is that we should go into a space where several types of hourly profiles should be tested or developed, and at least in a first pass within the load forecasting space in the IRP process, there should be a discussion about not only what kinds of profiles could arise, but what kinds of profiles the utility and the regulator want to see. Again, this is a new era where these larger end uses will be manageable into an extent that the load forecast will stop being an external input into the IRP, but might become, in part, a product of the planning process itself. A second practice that I want to touch here is in terms of the granularity, the space granularity of the forecast. Traditionally, a single system-wide forecast has been produced, and essentially assuming a copper plate, which is a way of simulating the entire system as a single nodal point. That might work still for very small systems like some munis, but for the IOUs that most of you regulate that have large footprints, this is insufficient. The current best practice is a zonal forecast that at least recognizes that are hot pockets in the system, and this is both from recognizing the transmission limitations that exist, but also very importantly recognizing that especially in utilities that are relatively large and encompass different climate zones, the patterns of load consumption are quite different, and hence separating the utility in certain zones allows to recognize those idiosyncratic aspects that will command not only the deployment, but also the usage of different types of end uses in the load forecast. We believe that the emerging practice here is to build into much more granular forecasts at probably the substation level, or even ideally, and this goes to the commissioner's question about the links between distribution system analysis and bulk power system analysis. Ideally, we'll get to a point where the load forecast will be produced bottom up at the distribution system level, at the end use level, and then go all the way up to the bulk power system by aggregating, both the adoption levels and the profiles, and construct about a full bottom up distribution and bulk power system forecast that will serve multiple regulatory processes. Finally, in terms of looking into a little bit of the scenario use of forecasts, now fortunately relatively extinct application of load forecast is just a single one. The best practice that probably most of you see these days is a high and a low forecast. Roughly, it sort of suggests that due to economic fluctuations in economic activity, you can go a little bit higher, a little bit lower. Typically, this is a 3% growth versus a 1% growth, whereas your median is 2%. As you are already starting to see, this is already insufficient. The types of percent increases that some utilities have put forth in their very latest IRPs are in the two-digit growths. So the emerging practice that needs to be actually developed quite quickly is to do forecasts based on scenarios, essentially produce scenarios that are intrinsically consistent. And each one of these scenarios will have its own forecast, because each scenario will also include a number of specific policy or regulatory considerations that will impact the way end uses will be adopted, the speed at which it will be adopted, where they will be adopted, and how they will be used. All of these considerations will produce, and given the scale of these new end uses, will produce large differences between forecasts. And so the high-low won't be useful. It will be a scenario-based load forecast where each forecast will follow a technical and economic and a regulatory and policy logic. And this is something we're kind of reflecting on the report, where we make a large emphasis on the role of scenarios to manage the levels of uncertainty that we'll be seeing soon. I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about resource adequacy, again, because Anna is going to cover probably several of these aspects. I'm going to briefly mention that in terms of the planning reserve margin, the way we essentially calculate that buffer, that it's needed to ensure certain resilience or reliability properties for the power system. In the past, what is traditionally been done is to use a single planning reserve margin that was typically administratively set, and it was based on a single hour. Many utilities are transitioning, calculating those planning reserve margins based on stochastic models with a full hourly representation of the year, in which they test numerous instances of weather realizations, and they test the dispatch, especially for renewable resources, and the storage, all of those 860 hours. So this is producing planning reserve margins that are much more reflective of the actual properties of the system. And we're proposing that, and this is already happening actually, so it's an emerging practice, but there's a couple of examples at least already, especially in the Pacific Northwest, of iterating capacity expansion and resource adequacy models to do this process where the capacity expansion model suggests a certain portfolio. The portfolio is analyzed to check what are the shortfalls in the performance across a number of resource adequacy metrics, not only the typical metric of loss of load events, but crossing across many other metrics that reflect the magnitude, the duration, and the frequency of the shortfalls, and do this at a seasonal level, because renewable resources have a strong seasonality in many parts of the country. And then the outcome of the resource adequacy model, through some heuristics, can be brought back into the capacity expansion to tweak it, produce an optimal expansion that is now perhaps more or less expansive based on what the resource adequacy model is suggesting, and do this iteration to produce a satisfactory portfolio that not only is least cost, but also meets adequacy requirements. We're outlining in the report as well the need for capacity contribution calculations. This is this is very critical in the ISO RTO context because this capacity contribution does translate in a revenue stream from capacity payments to technologies. That's quite important, but it's also quite critical for IRP because this is what can be used to construct the relative contribution of resources in the load and resources table, but also to understand the choices of the planners into picking certain resources to meet adequacy targets. This is besides energy needs. Historically, the capacity contribution was largely based on historical performance. That's, as you know, mostly insufficient, and we have been moving into performing ELCC, the effective load carrying capability for variable renewable resources, and keeping the forced outage rate approach for non-VRE resources. We're proposing that an emerging practice is going to be to conduct ELCCs for each type of resource, and in particular focusing on the common mount failures that have been affecting certain types of technologies, and including not only the technology itself, not the unit itself, but also its fuel supply chain, which has been proving to be a failure point over the last few years. So this is essentially saying, let's build a much more sophisticated way to measure the capacity contribution for those stressful hours that considerates the types of failures that we're seeing happening. And finally, we're making a call here to look at resource adequacy as a regional phenomena, as a regional property. In the past, the mandates were for utilities to be autarkic in terms of adequacy. They had to have enough capacity to serve their own load and to have the buffer that you need for resilience and reliability purposes. More recently, we have seen a lot of emerging practices that are including contracts that utilities have, and also including the transmission element, the transmission capacity that is required to ensure that those resources are going to be available. And now we're saying that the emerging approach here would be to simulate larger transmission footprints. And again, there's at least one utility that we've reviewed that is already doing this and is simulating a much larger footprint outside of its own service territory and considering the actual transmission linkages and the behavior of the neighboring resources, because that way they're ensuring that those long-term contracts will actually be honored under the same types of consistent assumptions that they're using for their own adequacy analysis. Moving now into modeling, I'm going to, this is a quick sort of figure that we produced for this report, where we're kind of outlaying the linkages of a variety of models that are used in IRP. And here we're still omitting a few of them, but these are some of the models that have already been mentioned. You see the capacity expansion model, the resource adequacy assessment model, there's production cost models, of course, that interact and then calculate the cost of operation and the dispatch profiles. And there are sort of auxiliary studies like the DER and efficiency potential study that typically accompanies many IRPs. There are load forecasting and climate and weather models that are used for to fit into different portions. Here, what we're offering as a best practice is to make these model connections explicit. What you see here in this nice diagram is absent in terms of an explicit and clear communication of how the different modeling platforms are linked. Is absent in pretty much every single IRP we have reviewed. You have to infer what is going where, how the output of a certain chapter is feeding on a different section, or sometimes two sections ahead. And so what we're advocating is that we have to ensure that these models are all linked explicitly. We know what goes into where, and whenever those models share common assumptions, we have to ensure that those assumptions are indeed established clearly and transparently for the stakeholders to analyze, because we do know that those assumptions will permeate the entire plan. An emerging practice, as Bruce already mentioned, is to do some iterative approaches that reflects real world dynamics. And for example, one of these is the one that I was describing, the challenge of starting to see load not as this static and sort of external source, but as a dynamic resource that can be managed at least in some extent. And so current models cannot manage an endogenous load representation. They can't really solve that problem. It's a nonlinear problem. It's very hard to solve. But there are relatively easy ways to do smart iterations between the load forecasting and the capacity expansion and production cost model, and maybe the resource adequacy model, to go back and forth and determine what is the adequate level of flexibility that is economic and also helps the system meet its objectives at a lower cost. Some additional recommendations on the modeling side. Let me see how I'm going on time. I think I have some time here to spend a little bit here. One obvious one in the first practice here in the first row is let's use capacity expansion models. This sounds almost, for some of you, might sound almost like a non-recommendation. But the truth is that there are still utilities out there that are coming up with legacy expansion plans coming out of their own meeting rooms with no modeling support. And so at the very least, the best practice is to use capacity expansion models that are suggesting least cost investments. And the emerging practice that is already fortunately, we have seen in several utilities is to iterate the capacity expansion and the production cost models, because the capacity expansion model, given that it's a forward-looking model that decides investments, is sacrificing some aspects of representation of the dispatch, the very short-term operation. Production cost models that don't look into the future are able to produce a rich representation of the costs and technical performance of the system in the short term. So these two have to work together to ensure that the portfolio coming out of IRP is indeed a realistic portfolio that when implemented, it will meet all the short-term and long-term requirements. One thing that we're emphasizing in our report is that best practices that retirements have to be at least tested as part of scenarios. In the past, they were input as some coming probably from book values of the retirements that were largely financial decisions. Really, we're now proposing that these retirements have to be an economic decision for the system and for the customer in particular. So they have to be tested as part of scenarios, and let the, as a DLE in an emerging practice, let the capacity expansion model decide on what is the optimal timing and level of retirements. And this is something that we have seen, but is not as used. Models can handle this quite easily. Just as models can decide what to expand, they can also decide what to retire. And if the different generation units are implemented as individual units, the model can actually retire subsections of entire power plants based on units and their performance. So if there's typically more units that are more they're newer and they're more efficient, they might be staying online a little bit longer, but there are other units that may be optimal to retire given their high operational costs compared to other available resources. We're making a call here for demand-side resources. I've been also emphasizing already in the load forecasting how important it is to start thinking about load in a more active way, and some of the challenges that brings. From a modeling perspective, we're suggesting in the report two, and here I put them as a best practice and emerging, but these are really two approaches to do this. One is to include them as we have done typically as load modifiers, but make the demand side resource or act as a load decrement or a load modifier, depending on how it's simulated, because it might not be reducing, but shifting demand to save on capacity, and make this consistent with scenario assumptions. So back as I was describing this idea of building load forecasts for each scenario, one of the aspects would be how much, for example, do we believe certain types of resources will be adopted by users, how much the programs can produce in terms of flexibility, and then build that into the scenario and build that into the load modifiers that go ultimately into the load forecast that goes into the models. An alternative is to represent demand-side resources as an economic resource. Essentially, the capacity expansion models can and are actually able to choose buckets of demand-side resources of flexibility that they can deploy based on their costs. And you can think of this as a supply curve of demand-side resources, where you have some cheaper resources and then some more expensive resources, and the model can choose what is that level of equilibrium, and that typically results in much higher adoption of renewable of demand-side resources than the mandates that utilities have to comply with. So we believe this is a very important route to explore. And again, the technical aspects of the modeling are almost settled, are almost there. Perhaps the main doubt that both regulators and utilities have is, are these resources going to show up? And so, of course, the recommendation there is do a deeper dive into characterizing the resource adequacy contribution of different types of demand-side resources. I'm going to skip given time, I'm going to skip this last one and just spend a little bit of time in my last couple of slides. So all of these that I'm talking, especially on the modeling side, lead to the abandoning of the idea of the preferred portfolio? Should we just forget about the idea of having a single portfolio that moves forward? And we believe that no, not quite. The preferred portfolio remains important, but we should pay much more attention to the scenario analysis and the scenario outputs, and then how the different portfolios that come through those scenarios differ under this wide range of assumptions. So essentially, the idea is to see, is there a convergent type of portfolio, or given the potential variations in sensitivities and in the variables, do we have a really different potential portfolio as we look forward? And if so, then what are these potential least regret investments that are common across some of these portfolios that we can still move forward with? So we keep doing prudent investments and still have some flexibility to wait as some of these uncertainties resolve to make further investments. And this is fortunately enabled by the fact that some of the resources that are now part of these portfolios, especially solar, maybe storage, are relatively quickly to deploy compared to other resources. So waiting for better information becomes more feasible than before. This is particularly important for transmission lines with long deployment times. So understanding whether there are certain transmission lines that appear across different reports as a line that should be built gives more support to the purpose of approving that line and moving forward with it. And then the scenario shouldn't be just forgotten as soon as the IRP is filed. They should be tracked over time to understand whether the actual realization of certain variables is leading towards another scenario being potentially a better description of what's going on, and then using the past simulations to follow some of the guidelines from that scenario. And finally, in terms of scenarios, as I mentioned, we have plenty of these in the report. I'm just bringing a few ideas that we believe are going to be part of best practices. We will have to widen the ranges for uncertainty and become much more comfortable on using ranges in the 2 digits differences that was not part of the past. It's very important to produce clear metrics to evaluate IRP results, and this is particularly important for the regions that use scorecards, so we can compare especially the non-monetary aspects of these different portfolios more clearly. It will be important soon to integrate IRP into a non-electricity decarbonization targets, and there's not a lot of clarity how that would happen. But there are decarbonization targets occurring in industry especially that will translate into potentially very high loads showing up in IRPs. So at least an understanding of that, those perspectives is going to be important. And finally, we believe that it's important to start integrating IRP as a process, as a regulatory process with other regulatory proceedings, especially starting to share assumptions, starting to make clear what those assumptions are, and make them, percolate to other regulatory processes and modeling efforts. So here's my contact information and Bruce's as well. I don't think Bruce put, maybe you put yours, Bruce, but I wanted to make sure that both of us were here. If you want to reach out, especially about this recent work that Synapse and LBNL are leading.
Thanks so much, JP. Can you remind everyone when that report's due or expected?
I think we hope to have the report out maybe in a couple more months. If I'm being sort of conservative, it might be earlier, but it's going to go for a thorough round of external review very soon. And after that, it should be published. So hopefully the end of May or beginning of June.
Great. I'm not seeing any questions. I guess maybe I can ask a quick one and we'll see if any more roll in, and then we'll take our 10-minute break. I guess you mentioned some of those improvements and modeling enhancements. I'm wondering, to what extent are state IRPs currently looking at the impacts of energy policies in neighboring states or systems? Specifically, are there sort of approaches that might look at retirements and additions outside of the footprint being examined, but that might impact like transfers or have other impacts on the particular system in question?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's definitely been something that states that are part of ISOs and RTOs, but that also have utilities that are required to file IRP, have to deal with, because these issues become much more apparent in those contexts due to cost allocation problems. There's this institutional layer of cost allocation of transmission costs that prompts the need to be looking at what my neighbors are doing, and that transfers from the ISO RTO world into the IRP analysis much more actively. Outside of that, we don't see it as much, unfortunately, in non-ISO RTO territories. Utilities that have, that are outside of that space. But that's what we're advocating for utilities in general, to take a regional approach to their planning, to at least reflect the ecosystem around them, especially if they are reliant of those resources for imports, maybe from an energy adequacy perspective, but more importantly from a resource adequacy perspective, to know that the capacity will be there. And then, as you say, adding a layer of tracking the policy and regulatory influences that or events that may be occurring that could influence the availability, the retirement, essentially the whatever they're drawing on from those regions that could affect theirs. It could be particularly important now to track the treatment of these large point loads like data centers. There are some states that are moving into becoming more or less supportive of their deployments. And that means that if a neighboring state is becoming more hostile to those point load deployments, that means that they may show up in my state or vice versa. And so that could lead to big changes in the load forecast.
Great. Thanks. We have one more here. What are some of the carrots and sticks regulators can use to sort of nudge utilities towards the best practices? Also, does more complex modeling add another layer of complexity that can further stretch timelines and IRP team capabilities?
Yeah, that's a good question. So in terms of the carrots and sticks, I think it depends a lot on the state and the way the statutes are established. In some cases, the laws that establish and govern IRP are relatively broad and vague, and that gives more space to regulators depending on the relationships they have with the utilities to just require certain practices based on the types of the recommendations that we're making. And a lot of what we're making is not really onerous. Most of the data and the models are out there. It's just doing things differently, as Bruce was sort of establishing, doing them differently and doing them right. Some of the stuff that we're suggesting could add complexity or will add complexity, but the truth is that the uncertainty of the system is going to increase regardless, and hence the complexity of the models will have to grow in par if you don't want to have major reliability issues or major pressure on rates. And it's a matter of choosing exactly what areas we have to put the efforts on, and then focusing, the resources in those areas to get it right. Bruce, I see you coming online. I know if you want to add something here.
Yeah, thanks. I was just going to add that, I can imagine that a more complex modeling environment and, more demands, let's look at the integration with the gas system. Let's model distributed resources well, things like that could add weeks to the IRP process and the burden of modeling. On the other hand, some of the things I suggested could subtract weeks or months, so if you don't have to argue for, a month or two about getting the model inputs, or if there's some basic things were just sort of could be just assumed done, then that could make room for a lot more useful interaction and conversation.
That's a great point. There's a streamlining on both the existing practices that are inefficient, and then adding some of these new emerging practices and the model needs that we're proposing.
Great. Well, thanks again, JP. Really appreciate it. And we'll take our break. We'll come back at 2:25, and I'll find there's additional 5 minutes somewhere down the line here. So see you in about 10 minutes. Thanks. For our final, we're going to start back up here for our final two speakers. So first I'll introduce Wesley and Caitlin here. Okay, so Caitlin Murphy is a group manager and a senior analyst in the Impacts Analysis Group with the Strategic Energy Analysis Center. Her research interests involve evaluating how energy policies and technology innovation impact the evolution, operation, and environmental impacts of the U.S. energy system. She has a PhD in geophysics from the California Institute of Technology and a BS in Earth, Atmospheric, and Planetary Sciences from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Wesley Cole is a senior energy analyst at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. His work focuses on long-term planning, the U.S. power system. He specializes in renewable energy integration, the role of energy storage, the impacts of low-carbon energy futures. In 2022, Wesley was on a sabbatical at the Grant Public Utility District in Washington State, supporting their long-range resource planning efforts. He has earned a PhD at the University of Texas in Austin and a BS at Brigham Young University, both in chemical engineering. So we can go ahead and turn it over to Wesley and Caitlin. Thank you both.
Great. And I can share my screen, Elliot, if that's okay.
Wonderful.
I will at least try to.
There you go.
Okay, is that working okay?
Looks good.
Great. All right, thanks, Elliot. And thank you, everybody. We're really excited to be here presenting to you today. Our topic is accounting for uncommon resources in planning models. And for the next 25 minutes or so, we'll walk through this outline. Start with just a brief introduction to NREL's own planning model, which is like an IRP model, but it's for the whole country. So really what we're trying to do here is just explain why we're presenting to you today and introduce a few caveats that will help you put our presentation into the context of a more local planning process. We'll then walk through a handful of uncommon resources today and share our insights on some key considerations for those emerging technologies, some key features if you are looking to represent them in a planning model or if you are evaluating a planning model result that does include representations of these technologies. And maybe most importantly, to inject a healthy amount of skepticism into your review of those technologies because they are emerging, they're uncommon. We're still trying to get a handle on what they could look like in our future power system. Sometimes because they're brand new, other times because we're looking at new iterations of a technology that's been around for a long time. Okay, so just a quick introduction to our planning model, which is the Regional Energy Deployment System model. As I said, this is like an IRP model or a model that a utility would use in an IRP process, but it's for the entire country. So we start with the existing capacity mix today. We start with a representation of the transmission network. We incorporate all of the most recent data from EIA in terms of planned capacity additions and planned retirements. And then we start projecting into the future. So we take our load projections, we take the cost assumptions for technologies looking out into the future, and we ask the model to generate a least cost investment or a least cost portfolio of resources that will meet all of the requirements of the model, which include the load, but it also meets policy requirements, regulatory requirements, and different physical constraints on how the power system operates. Because we're looking at a huge region all at once, it is important for us to consider all the different resources that could be important within any individual region across the country. And thankfully, we can work very closely with the Department of Energy to get dedicated funding to try to especially understand these emerging technologies or uncommon resources, as our presentation is titled. So we do have dedicated funding from different offices at DOE to start to think about how would we incorporate these uncommon resources into planning models? What are the important features to capture? What are really the drivers and the costs associated with why one might consider investing in these technologies? And what are the important characteristics if you are going to accurately represent, or as accurately as you can, represent their competitiveness in an investment portfolio? So what we'll do is walk through about 5 different technologies that we have been working on actively over the last few years. As I said, we'll talk about some of the key characteristics for representing those. We'll also provide a little bit of analysis insights when they are available for a given technology, depending on where we are in our process of incorporating these technologies into our planning model. So I'll cover the first one, and then I'll hand it to Wesley to cover the rest of the topics. So the technology that I'll be talking about today is hybrid energy systems or hybrid power plants. Depending on where you are sitting as audience members, You might have already seen these come through in regulatory proceedings, especially if you're in the West, for example, a lot of proposals and a lot of existing capacity for the most common hybrid resource type, which is PV combined with battery technologies. But as you can see here, they already represent a large and growing share of proposed projects across the country, with more relevance depending on individual regions. PV and battery is the most common technology type that is being proposed, and that it's already being built today. But there are additional hybrid technologies being proposed, including wind with storage, wind with PV, wind with PV and storage, and then some hybrid configurations as well that incorporate fossil technologies into them. While there are a lot of different technology combinations that you can put together to generate a proposed hybrid power plant project, they do all have some shared key elements across them. So really, what is driving interest or investment proposals in these types of technologies? The first item is the potential for shared costs. So if you can build these things together and you can share especially some of your balance of system costs, that can reduce the overall project cost compared to if you were to build each component separately. So if you know PV and battery both are competitive in your territory, you can start looking at putting these things together to share costs and therefore achieve the same type of capacity, but at a lower overall investment and project cost. A second driver is the potential for increased capacity factor or increased output. In this case, if you can combine technologies that either have complementary production profiles or complementary characteristics, then putting them together might help you produce more output overall than if you were to put them separately and have to deal with transmission constraints or other limitations on getting the most value and the most output from each individual resource. The third driver of hybrid power plants is really interest in reduced variability. So as we add more wind and add more solar, we want to make sure that we have kind of a smooth and consistently available amount of energy on the system. At least that's a common desire. And putting these things together can help reduce variability. So if you look at the chart here, this is solar production following its normal kind of diurnal pattern. Depending on where you were to locate that solar plant, you could add wind that would help fill in the nighttime period. So in a location where wind is predominantly blowing at nighttime, that helps fill the gap and smooth out the overall output from that individual power plant. Not necessary from a grid operating perspective, but it does help make things a little bit more predictable, a little bit easier to rely on that plant to have more available power throughout the day. And then finally, battery is a common characteristic to add as well because of its dispatchability, because you know that if you do need it, for example, during a cloudy period or during an eclipse, for example, you can get more consistent output from that power plant if you do have a battery that you can pre-charge and make sure is available during periods that you're especially worried about. So I'll just walk through a couple of key features that we have found in our work implementing hybrid technologies in our planning model. The first one is, it's not as simple as to just say, you know, wind is cheap where I'm located, solar is cheap. If I put them together, they must be competitive as well. You really have to look at the nuances of that plant, and that includes really high resolution representations of all the different important characteristics. So the first one highlighted here is the need to look at hourly resource data. You really need to know if that wind and solar, for example, are operating or are producing outputs at different times of day. So the plot on the right shows hourly output through the entire year for this individual location here from the arrows. Blue is wind, red is solar. If you see them overlapping, then they're both producing at the same time. And unless you build transmission capacity that can accommodate both of them, this is potential for, you know, wasted energy or curtailed energy. If you look at these sorts of periods in the summertime or in the shoulder periods, you start to see times when wind is producing at night, solar during the day, you end up with a smoother output. But if you're not looking at the hourly resource data, you're not going to see that type of synergy or benefits of putting these technologies together, where the ultimate benefit is now you can build less transmission to get the same amount of renewable generation on your system. It's a slightly different story for PV and battery, for example, but ultimately it comes down to the same thing. You need that hourly information to know, will my battery be charged when I want it to be charged, when I'm depending on it for either resource adequacy contributions or because I know that there's a lot of demand in those shoulder hours right when the sun has gone down and air conditioners are still running or EVs are being charged. So that's the first characteristic for hybrid energy systems. The next is that it really is a site-specific value proposition. So again, it can't just be wind is good where I'm located and solar is good. Really, you need to find a location where both are feasible and viable, and that production profile really suggests synergies between them. In this case, this is an analysis example result on the right that shows basically a least cost optimization in Texas when we don't allow PV and battery to site together and achieve cost savings by being deployed together. That's what's shown on the left. So this is where you wanted to build, the model wanted to build the wind plants in this. This is a pretty heavy decarbonization scenario, so lots of wind being deployed. Also lots of solar being deployed, but in this slightly different spatial pattern. When we allow the IRP-like model to invest in a hybrid technology instead, you don't see a lot of change in the wind solution. So we're still building wind in all the same places, but we do see that the solar has started to spread out to align with the spatial pattern of the wind deployment. So ultimately what we find in our least cost optimization is when you allow for a hybrid investment option, what happens is whatever the kind of anchoring technology is, it continues to be deployed where it was originally. But now a secondary technology sees value in really relocating itself to be in the same place as whatever that anchoring technology is. And at the very bottom of the slide, I have the examples that we've found so far, which is for PV and wind hybrids, our model tends to see value in relocating the PV to where the wind resource is. That's because wind resource strength really depends on where you are. Also very sensitive to transmission costs. And so PV relocating to wind makes sense. The same story is true when you look at PV and battery. The battery tends to like to relocate to the PV because the PV depends on the quality of the local resource. The battery is a little bit more flexible in terms of being able to be deployed in that location and still generate a lot of the same value. The last point I'll make on PV and battery systems or PV and wind systems is putting all of this together, it really is the point of a hybrid system is to be able to produce energy at times of very high value. It's not to produce as much energy as possible. It's not to produce energy at any time of the day or the year. It's really to be able to produce energy when you want it, when the system needs it, and when the plant can make revenue by being able to sell energy when it really is needed by the customers. To that point, the example plots on the bottom really show if you just tell the model, I want to see the lowest LCOE, you'll get the pattern on the right. And that's really showing that between the really strong wind resource areas and the strong solar resource areas, that's where you want to build hybrids because you're getting that balance between the two different resource strengths. You're getting the most output by putting them together. The pattern on the left is what we see when we tell the model, I just want whatever's best for the system overall. I want to minimize my system cost. Now we see a slightly different spatial pattern in terms of where the hybrid systems offer the greatest value. Point being just that we can't rely on LCOE as an indicator of where hybrid systems might make sense. We really need to weigh the cost and value at those individual sites to see where it can provide the greatest benefit for the power system overall. Last slide from me. I haven't talked very much about concentrating solar power, but you might think of CSP as kind of the original hybrid system. So combining solar generation with thermal energy storage. In general, I think it's a lot like PV and storage, but there are some nuances. This is also a much more regional resource where we would expect it to be more competitive, especially in the Southwest and less relevant in other parts of the country, whereas PV and battery tend to have relatively good economics across the country. So just wanted to acknowledge that this is one of the most dominant hybrid technologies on the system today on a total capacity basis. We don't see as much of these projects being proposed on the system today, and they are a little bit more limited in terms of where they might make sense in the future. But overall, I think a lot of the lessons learned from PV and battery would apply to concentrating solar power as well. So with that, I'll hand it over to Wesley. And Wesley, if you want, I can just advance the slides for you.
That'd be great. Yeah, so yeah, Caitlin talked about hybrids. I'm going to talk about several other technologies in here, and not going to go quite as deep, but happy to take questions on them later if you want to talk more about any specific technology. So first, talking about new nuclear. So when people are thinking about new nuclear, or at least the kind of plants that I hear people talking about are not the Vogtle plants, you know, the AP1000, very large plants. They're mostly small modular reactors. They might be the same technology, but there's a lot of other technologies being proposed out there. In terms of what we've seen in our modeling for the role that new nuclear could play in long-term resource plans is cost is the #1 driver of the role that nuclear plays. The costs there's a wide range of costs out there. They vary by technology. They vary by your viewpoint on how much international learning might influence US costs or how much they might not. So, current costs out there anywhere from $5,000 to $20,000 a kilowatt. Just for context, a new natural gas plant is on the order of $1,000, $1,500 a kilowatt. So this is one that's a pretty high cost for a plant, and the range is huge. So where you pick on that range is going to have a big influence on what kind of role it plays. Other factors that are important here when you think about costs of financing a nuclear plant might take 6 years to construct. If you have to accrue financing costs throughout that period, that could be pretty substantial. Your fixed operations and maintenance costs could be fairly high for these plants. There's a lot of nuclear specific things, like plant security is something that's an extra thing you have to think about. And then the last piece that's pretty important is the energy community bonus tax credit from IRA. Because these plants are so capital intensive, getting that extra 10% bonus matters a lot. So if you have a retired coal plant site in your service territory in your area, you're like that matters a lot to get that extra 10% discount versus if you don't have that kind of opportunity. Let me go to the next slide. So I'm summarizing a few of those things in this figure, as well as one other aspect, which is utilization. A lot of times when people talk about new nuclear and the role of new nuclear and long-term resource plans, they often think about it as, oh, it could serve as a flexible resource. New nuclear plants the designs are intended to be flexible. So a lot of them are designed to be able to turn down to 25% or 40%, so they could move around a lot more like a gas combined cycle would. And so a lot of utilities think, oh, perfect, we'll have a lot of wind and solar. We'll use nuclear as a flexible resource to balance the wind and solar. But then they do their cost estimates based on a 95% capacity factor, where they say, well, that's because that's how they run today. Nuclear plants run today at basically a 90 to 95% capacity factor. But if you utilize it less, then that changes the relative cost of that energy that's coming out of it. So this is illustrating that point that 50% capacity factor in blue versus a 95% capacity factor in green changes the levelized cost of energy out of that plant under a range of capital costs, so from $2,000 to $12,000. And then the last piece that's highlighted here is what kind of lifetime you're evaluating it over. A 30-year lifetime versus 60-year lifetime could change those relative costs. So these are all going to be probably under the hood kind of things in terms of how a utility is looking at new nuclear. Are they using a 60-year life for recovering it, or are they going to recover costs in 30 years? Are they assuming it has a high capacity factor versus low capacity factor? Is that endogenous? The model figures that out itself, and it's just it's doing all those trade-offs. So this is just part of those conversations. You often hear utilities say they like this resource because it's a base load. In some ways, yes, nuclear can base load, but it's really the value of new nuclear is that it's always available. That's its key feature rather than a baseload capability. You would go next slide here. So just a couple last considerations for new nuclear. One, the initial advanced reactor plants are scheduled to come online around 2030. There's a couple of scheduled 2029. It's unclear if they'll make it on time or not. But and then there's a number of utilities that have said they're interested in new nuclear. Their timeframes around 2035. So if a utility is coming and it hasn't already been looking into this yet, it's really that given this, there's not a huge supply chain of advanced reactors out there that you could just go order one and they'll get it delivered. They're still figuring out how to build these things. So it's probably going to be hard to get a new nuclear resource online before 2035, unless a utility is already engaged in that process. The plant, there could be challenges that push that back. So maybe that becomes 2040 or even later. It's unlikely to move the other direction. It's unlikely that things will go so well that this will move up. So it's really only that it's likely to shift one direction. But in terms of thinking about, a lot of places are looking at this in the context of decarbonization. So bringing online new nuclear, when could you get it online? This is an important piece to take into account. I'm gonna go to the next slide here. So we're going to now talk about carbon capture. So this is, you're burning coal or you're burning natural gas, capturing the carbon emissions out of that, and then sequestering or storing that carbon underground, either in a depleted oil well, or maybe an active oil well is enhanced oil recovery, or you're going to put it in a salt cavern underground somewhere. So some of the key pieces here are policy drivers. So one of the important pieces of carbon capture and storage is that they are not a zero carbon technology. So carbon capture is typically a 90, or they're designed for 90% capture, 95% capture. So they're capturing a lot of the carbon, but not all of the carbon. So if your region or entity is moving towards zero carbon, you can't actually get zero carbon with CCS, but maybe they still count. Maybe you have clean energy credits and carbon counts for the clean energy credits, or whatever it looks like there. But that's an important piece, is its interaction with the current clean energy requirements or emission requirements of the region. And then the second piece is you can put carbon capture on biomass plants, and those could be negative emission places, because you grow the biomass that takes carbon in, and then you capture the carbon from burning it, and then you store that. And so there's a lot of questions about how you deal with that, and the various elements of accrediting a negative emission versus not. So there's a lot of dimensions here in terms of carbon accounting that come into play with carbon capture plants. So these plants, they have been demonstrated as technically viable. So it's like new nuclear plants, there's a lot of them that they're demonstrating the technology now. Carbon capture has been demonstrated. The uncertainty with carbon capture is not about its technical viability. It's more about the cost and its total emissions impact. So there's questions about leakage upstream from if you're a natural gas plant, you're leaking methane upstream. Do you have to account for those emissions too when you're capturing your carbon? What about downstream leakage? If you're moving your CO2 through a CO2 pipeline, does some of that get leaked out and you're not capturing as much? Or maybe the plant's ramping more, or maybe the carbon capture portion is offline more than you expect it to be. So there's a variety of certainly technical elements of that, but the technology is a thing. And then the last aspect, if you want to go to the next slide, is that storage is a locationally dependent element here. So this is one assessment of storage costs for carbon dioxide. Darker color is more expensive, lighter color is cheaper. If there's no color, then that means there's not a storage site there. You'd have to pipe it. So like if you're in Iowa, you'd need to move. You'd have to build a pipeline to somewhere else to be able to put that CO2 underground somewhere. So where you could build a carbon capture plant, or where you might have to move the CO2 after you capture it, is an element that has to be considered as part of these resource planning processes. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. So we're talking about hydrogen now. So hydrogen's gotten a lot more excitement with the tax credits, because hydrogen is pretty expensive to produce, but the tax credits could lower that cost potentially considerably. The rules are still pending, but some of the key aspects of hydrogen are, one, you can produce hydrogen from electricity. If you're doing that, you have to account for the increase of electricity, and that could be a big driver here. So if you're going to produce, if you're going to build wind and solar to produce hydrogen, that then becomes part of the planning process. And then the other piece is that hydrogen is getting consumed. You can consume hydrogen for electricity production. So hydrogen can be on both sides, both the production side and the consumption side. You could use gas turbines or fuel cells to produce electricity from those. Your fuel costs are probably going to be pretty high. It's unclear what the role tax credits are going to play here. You want to go next slide? And the other related piece with that is hydrogen. Hydrogen is not really a technology; it's a fuel. Fuel might need to be transported depending on where you're producing and consuming it. It might be hard to transport hydrogen. Hydrogen is a very small molecule, which makes transportation difficult. So that might lead to more incentive to produce and consume at the same place. So depending on what kind of models being used in integrated resource plan, if this isn't, there's no co-location or no transport, what you don't want to have happen is production happening on one side of the state and consumption's happening on the other side of the state for the hydrogen, and you haven't accounted for any transport cost, or it's not even possible to transport it. And so you're assessing things incorrectly as you're looking at those elements. The other piece here is that the technologies that convert pure hydrogen into electricity, they're still relatively new. Like you can't go out and buy a 100% pure hydrogen combustion turbine today. The developers say they think they could build them, but they're not, like you can't just get one delivered today. So they should show up at some point, but they're not off the shelf today. Same for a large scale hydrogen fuel cell. fuel cells do work with producing electricity from hydrogen, but you can't just go out and buy a system for a 100 megawatt fuel cell system a day, because people have been building those. So there's still some newness to these technologies that you have to be careful with. And then finally, when you run a hydrogen plant, if you're going to produce electricity from hydrogen, because the hydrogen is a relatively high cost fuel, you're not likely to use that plant a lot. Like it's likely to be a peaker plant where you're using it during times of system stress. So because you are going to have a low utilization rate of that plant, you're going to have to store the hydrogen. So you'd have the hydrogen stored, and then when you need it, you'll consume a lot of it, and then you won't use it for a while. So somehow that storage needs to be taken into account. Okay, you want to go next slide here? So last technology I'm going to talk about is pumped storage hydropower. This one's not really a nascent technology. It's been around. We have a lot of pumped storage in the United States, but it's newer in that we don't build a lot of haven't built pumped storage for a while, or much of it. But there's a lot of potential opportunity to do that. Some of the key pieces here are that the lifespan of pumped storage is a lot longer than batteries. So even though it's more expensive potentially in a battery system, the longer lifespan can make it much more valuable. And they have pretty good round trip efficiencies. Around 79% is fleet-wide average in the US. We'll go next slide here. So some of the pieces here that the reason people are thinking more about pumped storage is not, it would be pretty challenging in a lot of locations to build pumped storage off of an existing river or existing water resource. So a lot of these are what are called closed loop. So you'd have reservoirs that don't the water's just there, just stays in these reservoirs. So for example, you could have, in this case, have these two dams, dam 1 and dam 2, and you're moving water between the two reservoirs, and that's it. So the water is not flowing anywhere, it's just shifting between these two reservoirs as your storage system. So that creates a lot of opportunities to have a reservoir and just move water between them. So go to the next slide. The other way this could happen, they don't have to be right next to each other. You could have a pipe that connects those reservoirs. So for example, in this figure here, you could have an upper lower reservoir that are connected via pipe. They could have a pretty high difference in height, which gives you more storage space. So that opens up more kinds of opportunities to build pumped storage resource than what the traditional pumped storage might look like. So you go one more. So we've done some resource assessment with this, looking at pumped storage resources. There's quite a bit of opportunities. Each of these black dots is a place where there is a technically feasible place to build pumped storage. Whether or not you'd want to build there is a separate question, but just that there's quite a bit of this resource that's available in a lot of different parts of the country, which makes it an interesting thing to start considering in terms of storage technologies. Because water is a relatively cheap medium relative to lithium-ion batteries, you could get longer durations out of these pumped storage than you might get out of a battery storage system without really changing the cost much. Like doubling the size of the reservoir might be relatively low cost for a pumped storage system versus doubling the energy storage in a battery could be pretty high cost because you have to buy a lot of batteries. So go next slide. So just in summary here, as we've gone through these, and again, happy to take more questions about it if you want to dig any more, is that these resources that have not been traditional resources for IRPs, there's likely to be more of them because people are continuing to innovate. There's more that's happening there. And I think is a good thing. It's basically you have additional tools for achieving planning objectives. Maybe the resource isn't going to work for your area, but that's fine. It might work well for somebody else. And then that last piece is that there's a lot of nuance isn't quite the right word, but there's a lot of specifics with each technology, and that makes it so that it's unlikely there's going to be new technology. It's like, this is the best technology for everywhere. There's probably going to be specifics for different regions that different technologies will work well at different places. So a place that has low quality wind and solar resources, and you want to decarbonize, that makes nuclear potentially a lot more attractive than another place where you have really abundant wind and solar resources. So all these things work together in terms of what kind of resources might be most valuable. And then the last piece is that there's a lot of experts out there to support these decision making. So this is our team at NREL that does this long-term planning modeling. There's a lot of these kinds of teams at different organizations, and in many instances, we're all very happy to help. Like, we enjoy working with the actual people who are doing the planning, and happy to provide some expertise along the way. So go ahead and close out there, and happy to take any questions.
All right, great. Thank you both. We do have two questions, both from Manu, and the first one is, do you see CPS making a comeback in lines of long duration energy storage?
Sorry, say this technology again? I heard an acronym. I want to make sure I heard the right one.
CSP.
CSP. Caitlin, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, I mean, I guess this is by nature sort of an opinion question. My vision for CSP, and CSP is the first thing I worked on when I came to NREL, actually, is, it's going to have a hard time competing in the near term with PV and battery, because PV has come down in cost so much, and batteries have that duration that is really valuable to us today, and valuable to us in the next few years as well. I think of CSP as kind of a potential solution if we can get the cost down, if we can innovate in a way that really makes it flexible and easier to produce in non-custom ways, make it a little bit more kind of like a quick manufacturing process that can be deployed easily in different locations. I think it could be a very nice solution, especially as you're approaching a fully decarbonized system, if that's what someone is planning for. So I think it's going to have a hard time making a comeback today, but I wouldn't write it off. I think, I know I have a colleague at NREL who used to think CSP was the answer, and PV was never going to outcompete out CSP, and then look at where we are today. So it really just depends on what types of innovations and breakthroughs we can have in cost. But certainly an intriguing and interesting zero carbon flexible technology if we can get those costs down.
And certainly the thermal storage aspect is a piece that is like, there's a number of companies that are looking to innovate just in that thermal storage space. And you could have some and this is the part that's like, it's not really a technology, but this cross-sector interaction. What happens if you have an industrial facility that wants to start doing electric heat and is going to use electric thermal, and you're going to use thermal storage in that process? And now that becomes a demand response resource for the grid. So it could get many dimensions pretty quickly when you start integrating these pieces together.
Oh, I think you're muted.
Thanks very much. Yeah, we have another question from Anu. What is the path for innovative technologies to get included in utility planning models, and how can companies address perceived technology risks?
Yeah, I mean, I just one perspective. I mean, so when I was a utility a couple of years ago, the utility, had a MOU signed with a nuclear company that they were very interested in small modular reactors for their service territory. So I mean, in that sense, they were very much pursuing a technology that they had a lot of excitement about and they had a lot of interest in. So I don't know how you weigh that against, like, what's the role of other groups? Is it like, oh, you're looking at this one, maybe you should look at these other technologies too while you're doing that, or you're putting too much energy? Like, at what point? This is a really hard question, right? Like, when should you weigh in, and how should you weigh in? And I think from my perspective in the long-term modeling, I really want to know what the potential are for technologies. Like, if nuclear is going to be successful, is that going to change the game for a resource plan? Or is it like, no, our plan's still good, even if nuclear is successful, it's not a good fit for our territory? That seems like a really important question to me as a planner. But where you draw the lines, because there's, could be infinite combinations of new technologies at various stages, and you can't evaluate every little thing because resources are limited. So there are some analysts, expert judgment that comes into play in terms of where we're going to define the scope for the kinds and types of new technologies you want to look at.
All right.
Yeah.
No, go ahead, Caitlin. Do you have
Sorry, I
anything
can
else?
make it very quick, but
Yep.
just, I think the biggest question is, when do you want to add it to your planning model? In terms of how, I think, the model that we run, we make all of it publicly available. So I think there's lots of resources out there when somebody does make that decision that it is time and it's relevant to incorporate an emerging or uncommon resource into their planning model. It's not that simple, but there's lots of resources available, and we are trying very hard to make it all publicly available. But the bigger question is, does it make sense right now to put small modular reactors in my model, or is that something I might want to revisit 5 or 10 years from now? And I think that's the harder question, in my opinion.
All right, Caitlin, Wesley, really appreciate y'all and your presentation. We're going to move forward to our final presenter now. We have Dr. Anna Mavella, who's the founder of Blue Marble Analytics, a consulting and software firm that specializes in developing advanced analytical tools for power system planning, and is the primary architect of GridPath, Blue Marble's comprehensive open source grid analytics software platform. She has 15 years of experience developing and applying the various tools for electricity grid planning and operations focused on integrated resource planning and resource adequacy. Anna holds a PhD from the Energy and Resources Group and an MPP from the Goldman School of Public Policy at the University of California, Berkeley. So Anna, take it away, and then we'll have some time for cross-cutting questions at the end here.
Excellent. Hello everyone, and thank you very much to NREL for the opportunity to present to you all today. I'll be talking about, I guess, a more narrow topic here. It was already touched upon, JP touched on it a little bit with kind of one of his boxes and one of his tables. But yeah, I'll be talking about just some concepts and approaches for how to think about resource adequacy assessments in the context of this, evolving regional grid mix, kind of both additions of resources of different types, then retirements of some of the existing resources, and then how that may affect import availability, and then just some learnings from some of our recent work for how to think about this topic. So first, why is it important to consider that? Why is it important to consider neighboring grids when we think about resource adequacy assessments? And then just backing up, resource adequacy is, of course, the idea that an individual utility, a load-serving entity, should have sufficient resources to meet its loads some very large percentage of the time. Maybe not always, that may be prohibitively expensive, but kind of almost always. So there will be some fairly stringent, reliability standard for how frequently they can experience loss of load. And this is where load and resource diversity can really help. There is diversity in loads. Say the Northwest United States has been historically winter peaking, and California and the Southwest are summer peaking. There will be time zone differences within the region, so the timing of the loads will be a bit different. And also these kind of high load events, they tend to be driven by weather systems, heat events, of course, and kind of the associated air conditioning loads. But those extreme events do not, at least not usually happen kind of everywhere at the same time. And then similarly on the generation side, solar generation will be different depending on cloud cover. There will be kind of that sort of time zone difference again. And then the output of one wind plant and how windy it is at one location will not be correlated with how windy it is at another wind plant, kind of a few hundred miles away. And then you can see kind of a quick example on this map that I have on this slide here. So this is the map of the maximum temperature on June 21st, 2021 across the West. And this is the day of the infamous Pacific Northwest heat dome event. This was kind of a historic heat wave in the Northwest. It was very, very hot, kind of all over the place. Temperature records were broken. I think it reached 108 in Seattle that day and 116 in Portland. And then, summers have just generally been getting hotter in some of these places. So more people now have air conditioning. So there are these historically winter peaking systems that increasingly are dual peaking or even summer peaking. And then these sort of high summer loads could lead to potential resource adequacy problems in the summer. And this is the type of event that an individual utility in the Northwest may kind of really be concerned about right now, and really emphasize, as it's kind of new and challenging and kind of scary. But on this day at least, even though it was really off the charts hot in the Pacific Northwest, there were actually milder conditions in the rest of the West. Like it was pretty normal temperatures along the coast in California, where the load centers are. It was cooler than average in the Rockies, for example. So this was a geographically isolated event, which does not necessarily result in kind of this high loss of load probability. And on this day, the other regions did have spare resources and could send power to the Northwest. to meet that kind of more localized challenge. So all of this to say that resource sharing can be a cost-effective alternative to procuring resources and to kind of overbuilding the local system. And yeah, I don't think that I'm the only one who would argue that this type of resource sharing and coordination is really a necessary component for deeper decarbonization that actually maintains reliability and then keeps electricity affordable. So considering neighbors and planning is important, but it is also very challenging for a number of reasons. First of all, as kind of one might expect, kind of the larger the system that we need to consider, the more data intensive the exercise becomes. So there's a challenge in both finding the data in the first place and then kind of processing the sheer amount of data here. Second, there was already some discussion of this, but all of this data, it will really increase the size of the problem and really requires kind of complications to the models. But probably the most important challenge, I would say, is just simply the uncertainty that is associated with this. Like nobody knows how the grid will actually evolve. So what do we assume? It's a interconnected grid, it's interdependent, but in the West, at least, we have pretty siloed planning for resource adequacy for now. Like most of the West is not part of an ISO or an RTO. So planning for resource adequacy usually stays within these individual utility IRPs. And for each one of those, there will be a lot of uncertainty for kind of what is everybody else going to do? And no jurisdiction really or control over, and again, how the system as a whole will evolve. And as a result, like what can we rely on for resource adequacy purposes? So just a few notes on the data and modeling challenges. Yeah, even assuming that we can get all the data, and again, there are a lot of data gaps out there. We're looking at understanding all of this complexity now, loads and resource output and transmission and outages from many more power plants. And then especially for resource adequacy exercise, we need to look at many, many years of data, like many weather conditions. And you can imagine that would kind of very quickly add up. But it is really absolutely necessary because by its nature, sort of the fundamental issue with reliability analysis is that it looks for events that are very, very rare. And what it means is that we actually do need a lot of data in order to be able to find those events and understand their frequency. And then there's the model itself and what the model needs to be capable of to resolve the rest of the region. I'm listing a few of those here. So first, the model needs to be able to account for these complex weather correlations between load and resource availability over these large geographical areas. So it needs the temporal span and resolution. It needs the geographic span and resolution to capture all of these relationships. Then two, we already talked about kind of all of these new types of resources that potentially need to be considered. Just the fact that the system is becoming more complex and dynamic as it increasingly is relying on energy limited resources. So that will be things like hydro, storage, hybrid resources we talked about, because all of these, they will operate and interact with the rest of the system, solar, the wind, and so on. So resource adequacy analysis kind of more generally is moving from statistical based models to actual kind of dispatch modeling of the system. It's what we sometimes call time sequential models that actually simulate the grid and the way that these resources will interact. And then finally, we need to be able to understand transmission, which is a resource. So coordination and using transmission can be a substitute for some of these other resources, for storage, for overbuild and so on. But it is also constrained, and we need to understand that constraint so that we can identify congestion issues and kind of what may be stopping us from accessing these kind of complementary resources on the other side of the transmission line. So, JP talked about this, but yeah, we are moving away from considering imports, well, ignoring them, kind of thinking of the system as an island, or just considering them as a constant, to kind of a more comprehensive view that allows us to understand what is happening on the other side of the transmission line. So with this as background, I will talk about just a couple of examples of how we have dealt with this problem of how do we think about the region as a whole, and what kind of resources the region may have or not have for resource adequacy planning. Again, the neighboring grids are a resource, but there is also a lot of uncertainty in what they will be able to provide and kind of what their own resource adequacy position is. So the question is, kind of how do we consider them in the analysis and benefit from some level of resource sharing and coordination without depending on them too much, given that, again, there is no control and no certainty over those decisions. And I think that the thing I really want to emphasize here is that there's no right or wrong answer to this question. It really comes down to risk tolerance and sensitivity to cost, and the trade-off between those. Kind of on one end, we could have a very risk-averse planner who might want to assume absolutely no reliance on neighbors when the system is constrained, so that it basically never happens that there's a reliance on assistance from the outside that just doesn't materialize. It doesn't show up when it's actually needed for whatever reason, whether because these other entities don't actually build the stuff, or some kind of transmission constraint or contractual issue, and so on. So we generally model that through an island lens, where we just don't allow imports into a particular footprint. What that means is that then overbuild will generally be required to reduce the resource adequacy risk. And of course, that can be a lot more expensive. And then, and on the other end of this, there could be a planner who is instead very cost sensitive, and might instead want to really have a good picture and understanding of the regional resource adequacy position, and kind of assume baking more reliance on resources that are outside of their own planning footprint. So I've been thinking about this, in general, there is more certainty about what the neighbors' resources and their positions will look like in the near term than in the longer term. So I'll just show you a couple of examples here in the next few slides. The first one is from a near-term study. This was a look at resource adequacy in the West for the year 2026. And then the second one was, and what I'm calling a longer-term scenario. It was a 2035 scenario, and we looked at an 100% clean electricity target for the PNS system, which is kind of a more uncertain future. Yeah, I do want to say here that both of these studies were sponsored by GridLab, and they were conducted in partnership with Moment Energy Insights. And then in the case of the second study, also with Telos Energy and with the Energy Futures Group. So the first study was called Advancing RA Analysis with the GridPath RA Toolkit. And the primary goal of that study was to develop a tool set, kind of an advanced tool set for sort of modern resource adequacy analysis to address some of those data and modeling challenges that I discussed earlier. But we also sort of showcased this tool that we built by developing a near-term resource adequacy study of the Western United States. And we looked at both the kind of overall West-wide regional pictures, and then a couple of sub-regions. This was a CAISO-like footprint, and a RAP-like footprint. RAP here is the Western Resource Adequacy Program. So what we did was we first developed these sort of 3 scenarios for the West-wide resource mix. The first one, what we call the no addition scenario. And in that scenario, we assume that all of the retirements planned through 2026 would happen. So capacity would be taken off the system. But we didn't include any of the planned resources, planned additions through 2026. So this was kind of a baseline. Well, what if no one does anything useful type of scenario? And then in the second case, we added the California planned additions from the California Public Utility Commission's preferred system plan through 2026. These were an important response in California to the 2020 outages in CAISO. And then finally, we developed more of a stress case for the system where we looked at what would happen if we accelerated coal retirements in the West. So what we did was we removed an additional 11 gigawatts of coal generation from that second scenario, from the California addition scenario in the less coal scenario. And then we looked at first the West-wide resource adequacy picture, and then we also did some sub-regional analysis of these CAISO-like and RAP-like parts of the system. Note that I'm saying CAISO-like and RAP-like here because this is not actually CAISO and RAP. Attribution is very difficult in these studies because of the lack of contractual information usually. So here we model the physical system without contractual information, and that's why I say CAISO-like and RAP-like. So just please keep in mind that these are just approximations of these two entities. Okay, so what did we find? So first I'll show you some results for the no addition scenario. And remember, this is the scenario where we took the system kind of as is, going through with some of the near-term planned retirements, but not adding any new capacity. And we did find in that scenario that basically without taking any action, the West could be physically short in 2026. It was by about 9 to 10 gigawatts. But an interesting part here, we're kind of the sub-regional perspective, is that we also took a look at the CAISO-like footprint. First kind of as a standalone islanded system, and then with considering import availability that was based on the West-wide simulation of the system. So you see 2 heat maps here. The first one is of the expected loss of load by month and hour in the CAISO in the island simulation. And then the second one, that's on the left, is the same heat map, but if considering the import availability. And you can see that accounting for imports, it does a few things. In this particular case, it substantially reduces the loss of load expectation, therefore the capacity need, and it concentrates the loss of load risk into fewer months and fewer hours a day. So it's, in this case, it's still the same kind of problem. It's kind of the summer, later afternoon and evening resource adequacy shortage. But if we do consider imports, then we can just kind of compress the problem. So these events are, they're shorter in duration, and they're less common in these shoulder months. And then once we added the planned California additions to this baseline case, we actually saw no more capacity need and resource adequacy shortages in the West. So then we wanted to put a little more stress on the system, and that's part of why we removed these extra 11 gigawatts of coal from the system. Then again, we ran the West-wide simulation. We did see some shortages at that point, and then we took a look at the sub-regional picture. And what you're seeing here on this slide are the results for the RAP-like footprint in the less coal case. And what we found was that if we did not allow RAP to benefit from regional resources, we saw substantial resource adequacy shortages in this scenario. Those were concentrated in the summer months, again, and were fairly long duration. And we're seeing this problem throughout the day here, but also in the mornings, midday, kind of late into the evening. But notably, and the interesting part is that without the cool and without the imports, we did also see these winter capacity shortages, resource adequacy shortages in RAP. And we know that this is a problem that people are concerned about. And these sort of cold, cloudy, windless winter days, when people need heat, and with electrified heat, we could really end up in these energy shortfall situations that manifest themselves as this sort of long duration shortage that the model is seeing here, that lasts throughout the day and night. So kind of while in the previous example, when we allowed imports, we kind of saw a compression of the problem, but it was generally the same problem. Here we can see even a different dynamic for allowing imports that again is based on the original picture, actually completely eliminated this winter risk, in addition to concentrating the summer risk into fewer months and fewer hours. So I think the takeaway here is that it's interesting to think about, not just the magnitude of the shortage that we may address with imports, but the fact that it is potentially a substitute for some type of technologies and mitigation options. What are the types of technologies and mitigation options that imports, based on an understanding of the regional picture, can be a substitute for? So the next case we'll look at is a longer term case. This is a 2035 100% clean case for PNN. And this case is longer term, not just because it's far removed in time from present day, but it's really that transformation to the system that we're looking at here, where there's a lot of uncertainty in that time frame with these types of targets. And this really requires very carefully thinking about kind of how to allow and really enable the resource sharing to really understand the dynamics and cost and feasibility of a system like this, but at the same time, once again, to avoid leaning and overly depending and relying on these other systems, given the uncertainty. So in this study, we tried to develop a framework for that, where the goal was to develop a methodology that incorporate these potential reliability benefits of importing energy from neighboring systems, but without overbuilding the rest of the system, the rest of the West here to benefit, in this case, PNN. And then on the flip side, we didn't want PNN to be solving, resource adequacy for the rest of the West. So this is what we did. Step one was to add the currently planned clean resources. These were based on just IRPs that we looked at, and then we removed all of the emitting resources across the West. And then in step two, we actually simulated the operations of the Western grid, but without PNN. And the goal there was to identify shortages that were not attributable to PNN, that were the rest of the region's problem. And then in step three, we solved that problem by adding a technology agnostic energy limited resource to the rest of the West to basically exactly avoid all uncertain energy in the West. So the West basically ended up with enough capacity and enough energy to meet its own needs, but no more in the modeling. So then any help that it could provide PNM would be the result of coordination benefits and not of having these kind of extra resources. And then in step four, we added PNM loads and resources back into the model, and then we simulated this whole system with PNM in it. And then we attributed any of the simulated shortages to PNM. So this is just kind of, again, it's just one approach The goal was to position PNM within a system that it could potentially benefit from, but that would not solve the problem for it. And then we could see kind of how that interchange played out, and how PNM and the rest of the West were able to share resources, but again, we knew that nobody had actually built stuff for other parts of the system. Just kind of in the interest of time, I will just go over a few takeaways at the end of this presentation. So the first point is that considering regional resource availability and coordination is a really critical, important aspect of resource adequacy planning. It is an alternative to resource overbuild and to other types of resources and technologies, but it needs to be done right. So we really need good modeling, good accounting for coherent weather conditions across the regions, for transmission constraints, in order to get meaningful results. An important takeaway is that if we do consider neighboring resources, that can really change kind of both the magnitude, but also the nature of the resource adequacy problem that we're looking at, kind of its shape, its duration, its timing. So again, it's not just a matter of the magnitude of resource build, but it can also change the type of solution that we think that we need. And again, we're speaking to regulators here. I really want to emphasize again that in the absence of regional planning, how integrated resource plans consider neighboring grids, the level of reliance that is baked into those IRPs is really a policy decision that will depend on the risk tolerance and the sort of willingness to pay to avoid that risk. So thank you. Look forward to your discussion, after discussion and your questions.
Anna, thanks so much. That was terrific. Really think that's a useful study, the moonshot, looking at the public service company of New Mexico, kind of as a case study, and making some assumptions about how 100% clean energy would impact flows in neighboring states. So that's a really good resource. Jessica drops NREL's advanced guide on long-term resource plans in the chat earlier. I'm also going to be sending out a list of related reports to resources from all our speakers today. So NREL, LBNL, Synapse Energy Economics, and Blue Marble Analytics. So please look for that email if you want to dig a little bit deeper into these topics. I don't see any questions at the moment, and I know we're coming up towards the end here. I did have a couple of what I was trying to formulate sort of cross-cutting questions for all our speakers here. I'll ask the first one here, and we'll see if any more questions from our participants roll in. But we're going to be talking next week about regional and interregional transmission in the final part of this three-part series. I'm wondering if you all might share thoughts on specific examples or of specific states, or even just general approaches that do a particularly good job with the IRP processes and modeling transmission, or at least the impacts of new projects, things like that. So again, anyone feel free to jump in. Anna, you can kick us off if you'd like.
Yeah, I mean, in California, the public planning process does very much take a regional picture of the entire West and kind of how the California resources are positioned within that. Once again, there will be an assumption that will be made about what is happening in the rest of the West, and there will be an assumption that will be made kind of on limiting the transmission and the sort of availability of imports, or how much is actually allowed into California, whether or not these resources are available. But it is very much a framework that kind of can incorporate that into the analysis.
Yeah, I have a very indirect answer to your question, Elliot, which is just that the long distance transmission planning challenges is one of the most interesting value propositions of the hybrid power plant model. If we have these big lines that we've already built for wind, for example, and we have times when they're being underutilized, evaluating the extent to which co-located solar could help use that transmission line to a higher degree, help get more renewables onto the system while we wait for the transmission planning process to unfold and to go through all of the necessary steps. It's one of the more interesting drivers of hybrid systems. So I'd be very curious to see if those start showing up in IRPs as part of the motivation for having a hybrid power plant in the solution.
Great, thank you. Bruce, JP, or Wesley, feel free to speak up. Otherwise, I got one more question. And we kind of go around. This is kind of a lightning round question, given that we're short on time. I guess maybe you could each share your thoughts on sort of the number one thing when you look across at all these processes throughout the country. If there was one thing that kind of sticks out to you all as the most important that needs to be perhaps modified as we move through the energy transition, what would be the sort of low-hanging fruit and the most valuable perhaps changes we could make to the general IRP process? And I guess I'll let Anna, yeah, you kick it off.
Yeah, I think the IRP process generally involves kind of these multiple models. JP talked a little bit about this. There'll be a capacity expansion model, perhaps. Then maybe a resource adequacy assessment, production cost models. And JP already talked about the sort of need to, as you're designing portfolios, to really start now testing them and making sure that they are performing as designed in, say, a resource adequacy assessment, production cost model, because in capacity expansion models, of course, we oftentimes need to make these simplifications. And sort of that process of iterating between the models, at least checking, but then hopefully iterating, I think could really improve the sort of the robustness of what these plans actually look like.
I will add, let me see on my mind. I mean, there's a lot of things that may happen, and I'm trying to split them in near term and sort of medium term. So I'm going to choose them for the medium term, and this is something that someone had already hinted at earlier, one of the questions, which is integrating distribution system planning with bulk power system planning. And right now it may not be an immediate need, but as FERC Order 2222 starts to be implemented and we have virtual power plants starting to potentially pop up, considering the joint planning processes will be fundamental to avoid either running the virtual power plants based on distribution system objectives that might be detrimental to the bulk power system, or even worse, running those plants based on bulk power system objectives that might cause massive reliability and overloading issues on the feeders. So a joint process, developing the joint process and ensuring that those plants are operated based on joint objectives will be fundamental probably over the next decade.
Yeah, my turn. Yeah, I'll put it in my pitch again. I don't think there's any one thing, but I think it leveraging the enthusiasm, resources, and brain power of the modeling capabilities of the stakeholders would go a long way. So if in the IRPs we don't overuse NDAs, we kind of make the data publicly available, provide the model inputs in a way that other people can run models and contribute constructively. And I think that would really improve the state of the art immensely and be important towards solving these other technical challenges in the modeling.
Yeah, kind of the transparency issue you mentioned earlier. Okay, great. And Caitlin, anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, it's maybe a non-expert opinion because I'm not intimately involved in IRP processes, but I would argue for more transparency and robustness to the load projections. I think misforecasting or missing the planning for electric vehicle charging in particular could be a very big mistake if we don't get it right. But on the other hand, load growth has been so slow for so long that people are very skeptical when they see high load growth projections at the same time. So just having more explanation and more robustness to that type of input into the planning process, I think would really help get us past that skepticism and really talking about, is this the right portfolio of resources to meet the build loads that we think will be coming?
Great. Well, thank you again, everyone, for your time today. As a reminder, we have our final course next Tuesday. Hope you can join us then. And until then, have a great day. Thanks so much. Bye.